This is the Psychedelic Milk podcast, and I am Ed Liu, where I will be a host today, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. And I'm not sure if I told you guys yet, but I've started a Patreon campaign. And if you guys don't know what Patreon is, let me do a little explaining. Patreon is basically the best way that independent artists, independent podcasters, independent musicians like myself are able to raise money directly from fans, from listeners that are you guys. And it is an awesome service because we're now able to raise money directly from you guys without any interruption, without any disruption, and best of all, without any corporations coming in trying to sponsor our podcast, trying to influence our message on this podcast based on their products, based on their services, and based on their agendas. And you know what, guys? I would love to have more money on this podcast. Of course, why wouldn't I? But I've already turned down a few major sponsors for this podcast because their message doesn't really jive with our message here on the Psychedelic Milk podcast. And I'm not willing to shove products and services down your face, down your throats, down your ear holes just because I'll be paid a little bit more money. I'm not willing to do that. And I'm not saying I'm some saint or I deserve an honorary medal of justice because I'm willing to deny, reject high-paying sponsors that are out to steal your soul. I'm not saying that at all. All I'm saying is that I would rather make less money but to promote a good message. And here's how Patreon can come in and save the day, because Patreon, it is the best way that you guys out there listening, wherever you are in the world, can support me, support the Psychedelic Milk podcast, and to keep us going, keep us strong. We have already received a lot of donations this month, and I want to thank every single one of you guys for doing that. It is amazing that you guys are listening to the podcast to begin with. It is a miracle to me. To me, when I wake up and I see the downloads every day, it makes my head spin. It makes me question whether or not I'm living in a virtual reality, because this is surreal to me. And for you guys to donate to the Psychedelic Milk podcast, to the Patreon campaign, it is simply amazing. I want to give a mega shout out to Constance Turner, who donated last week. We are on the $78 mark, and we are only trying to raise $100, so we have $22 more to go if my math is correct. And we're only asking you guys to donate $2 a month to the podcast, and everybody out there listening right now is able to go to patreon.com/psychedelic milk and donate $2 a month. We'll be good to go. This could be my full-time job. I could be doing this full-time. I could bring you guys video. I could bring you guys guests that you never imagined I would be able to do. I'll be able to travel to the guest location and to interview them directly instead of having this Skype stuff. So if you guys want to help out the Psychedelic Milk and to keep the discussion on the uses and benefits and potentials of psychedelics and its impact on society today, then please go to our Patreon and back our campaign. It is patreon.com/psychedelic milk. And trust me, they are trying to censor us from the internet. Big Pharma has its hands everywhere, and they are trying to shut down discussions on psychedelics across the world, especially in the United States. So we are one of the voices of psychedelics, and you know Big Pharma hates us, and they are trying to shut us down. They are trying to keep our mouths shut and to keep the discussion on psychedelics underground. So please help us grow, and the way you can do that is through our Patreon campaign. It is the best way that you guys can support us. Go to patreon.com/psychedelic milk. There is a Patreon link on my website on psychedelicmilk.com on the right hand side. All you gotta do is go there and click it, and all we're asking is $2 a month. $2 is a third of a Starbucks coffee. I am sure you can afford it. So please go to patreon.com/psychedelic milk and support psychedelics. And another great way that you guys can support the podcast is through Amazon. Amazon is a great place for you guys to shop because every time you shop through our Amazon portal, Amazon splits a small percentage to us and to the podcast. A very small percentage, I promise. So that is why Patreon is still the better option to support a podcast. But if you guys insist, you guys can shop on Amazon through our portal located on psychedelicmilk.com. On the right hand side, there's an Amazon link. Go through that link and you are in our Amazon portal, and everything you buy through that portal, through that link, Amazon splits a little percentage to us, and you pay nothing extra. So go through our Amazon portal located on psychedelicmilk.com. Even better to bookmark the link, so every time you're shopping on Amazon, you're supporting the podcast. And the product I want to recommend today that you guys can actually buy on Amazon, that to me seems a lot cheaper than retail, is actually pet food, dog food, cat food, lizard food, turtle food, whatever pet you got. I am sure that Amazon has a better price because that is what I do with my dog. Whenever I go to Amazon to buy dog food, it is almost 2 times cheaper than retail, say, at your local pet shop. They're really expensive when you buy the pet food at retail. And you guys know, the dog owners out there, cat owners, you guys know how much pet food costs. It costs a lot. And for you guys to be buying those pet food every single week or month, it takes a toll on your wallet. So I would highly recommend that you guys can shop through our Amazon portal to buy pet food. It is a really economical and better way to go. And I know for a fact that Amazon carries really fresh pet food out there. They are not expired. They are fresh, and my dog loves to eat them. So go through our Amazon portal to buy your pet food, and I am sure your dogs will thank you for it. Go through our Amazon portal located on psychedelicmilk.com on the right hand side and bookmark the portal and start shopping. And we are also brought to you by Audible. Audible is an app, it's a website, it's a service that's all about audiobooks. And you guys know how much I love audiobooks because you can literally read, or should I say listen to an audiobook anywhere you are, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. As long as you have your ears free, you can be listening to an audiobook and retain the information with you with the rest of your life if you have a good memory. Because guess what? Back in the Homo sapien days, back in the caveman days, I mean, we're still Homo sapiens, but nobody refers us to Homo sapiens anymore unless we're talking about history. But nonetheless, back in our caveman days, we used to have campfires, we used to hunt several days a week, and at the end of the night, when we're finished eating, when we're surrounding a bonfire with our friends and family, we tell stories. We tell stories about ourselves, about one another, about mythical creatures, about God even, about spirituality. And that is the way that we have been passing down information for millennia. And that is the best way to retain information because that is actually how our primate and primordial DNA was set up to retain and learn new information. And we did not have books until really recent history. And reading is actually a natural way to learn and retain information. And that is why I love Audible so much, because audiobooks enable you to learn much more in a shorter period of time. Because one of the new things that I like to do these days is to microdose and to listen to an audiobook in 1 1/4 speed. I believe that is the most optimum way and efficient way to read a book and learn about new stuff. I'm really digging this new book that I have right now on Audible that is called Sapiens. To be honest, I did not think much of this book when I first bought it on Audible because I thought it would be basically a short history on how human beings became human beings or Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens. But it has a lot of philosophical and spiritual implications within this book that I think is really, really awesome. And I'm getting a lot out of this book, and I'm not even halfway in yet. I believe the audiobook version is about 14 hours long, so this is definitely a steal, and it is a bang for the buck, because this book not only talks about mankind and how mankind rose to power amongst our friends in nature, but also talks about realities and the realities that we create within our society that are all subjective. There's a chapter called, I forgot what the chapter is called, but basically it talks about subjective and objective reality. And that's something that Corey Allen in our previous episode talked about, and it is kind of mind-blowing because it talks about these really obvious things that we participate on a day-to-day basis, but we kind of forgot that these are all subjective realities that we're living on. And when he points them out, it makes you realize that we are living in this imaginary world this whole time. Our society, money, government, corporations, justice, laws, they are all subjective reality, and we are living in this subjective world, a world full of imagination, and the shamans that control this world, like lawyers, like politicians, like the police force, they are all operating under a subjective reality. And I think it is fascinating to read the author's take about this, because he's a really philosophical guy, and I only read, or should I say listened to, half the book, and my mind has already blown off 12 times, because that is how mind-blowing this book is. And the way the book is written, the way that the book was narrated in the audiobook version is really, really easy to listen to. So I'm sure any of you guys out there are wondering if this will be a difficult read. I'm assuring you that it's not, because when an idiot like myself is able to dissect the information and understand what the author is talking about, then I'm sure you can as well. So I highly, highly recommend this book, and I think I'll be buying more of this book to pass out to more of my friends, because I think it is an important read for everybody living on this planet today, to know where we came from and to know why our societies are shaped the way that they are today. And it is a great deal, because you can actually get this book for absolutely free. If you go to audibletrial.com/psychedelic milk, sign up for the 30-day free trial membership, download the audiobook for free for nothing, and if you want to, you can cancel the membership for absolutely free anytime you want to, and then the audiobook is yours to keep. Whether or not you keep the audiobook service, you can keep the free audiobook. It is yours for the rest of your life. It is 14 hours long. Trust me, it is an amazing read, and I'll be recommending this book for a while. So please go ahead and get this book, audibletrial.com/psychedelic milk. And today's guest, we have Niles Heckman. I really enjoyed our conversation together. If you guys don't know, he is the director of the new documentary series, Shamans of the Global Village. We talked a lot about his experience with the toad medicine in Mexico. That was really interesting, because it is not every day that you get to talk to somebody with experience with the toad medicine, because everybody is doing mushrooms, LSD, or ayahuasca. Those are very common in the psychedelic world. But with the toad medicine, it seems like it is really hard to get, and it's hard to find guests that have that experience. So it's a really, really cool experience that he had with the toad medicine and with the 5-MeO-DMT chemical that is present in the toad. And we also talked a lot about spirituality, religion, occult sciences, and other mind-bending subjects at the end of the podcast. So I hope you guys will enjoy this episode with Niles Heckman. His documentary is very interesting. It is called Shamans of a Global Village. Do check it out. All the show notes, the links, everything is located on psychedelicmilk.com, so you guys can check that out. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Niles Heckman. So it is rolling right now, and yeah. But yeah, man,
Nice.
you know, like the podcast, and it's really awesome because, like we mentioned earlier, you know, it gives us the space to share these esoteric ideas that is really missing in the mainstream nowadays. And I think it's getting a little better with movies like Doctor Strange and, you know, one of our friends of the podcast, I don't know if you heard about them, but they were on recently. Actually, their film is premiering soon, and it's a psychonaut movie, and it talks about this guy who's obviously a psychonaut, and he goes through like a mind travel enlightening process. And there's more and more media out there, like right now. I think there's also Black Mirror, which is another cool series on Netflix, and there's another one. What's it called? Westworld. Right.
Yeah.
That one's really cool. I really like that one. So I think there's more and more media out there that's, you know, about these psychedelic spiritual journeys, but still it's really kind of still underground. You know, I think a lot of people can watch Westworld and not get the psychedelic message from it. They just think it's a cool AI TV series and not really think about, you know, the underlying message that comes along with it.
Yeah, well, there's kind of these themes that you see sometimes encoded deeper in things of these like non-local, you know, time tunnel, multidimensional themes in more mainstream projects, which you get. I'm always excited, you know, when I do see that kind of coming out of Hollywood. But then there's always projects too that are much more mainstream and successful in terms of commercialism at the box office, you know, things like Star Wars or Avatar that have, you know, wisdom themes in them that are very ancient. So it's not like these things that, you know, or the Matrix sequels, for example, which, you know, I've had a background kind of working as an artist, you know, periodically in and out of Hollywood. And I was very fortunate to work on the Matrix sequels when I was a young lad.
Wow.
And, you know, at the time I didn't know the Gnostic themes in them, but, you know, I do now. But in terms of something like Avatar that has shamanic themes, or the Matrix sequels that have these Gnostic themes in them, it's like those things are very commercially successful because I think they really tap into kind of the underlying subconscious of what's really going on with audiences who are always starving for good content, which is sadly usually lacking. But every once in a while, when something does come through that's pretty high budget and has some deeper themes, like you mentioned, Doctor Strange, you know, that's great. That's great. I think we can slowly move towards that with as budgets get bigger, but it's always a tougher sell. And so that's what I've found is like I'm always trying to, as kind of an independent filmmaker and a documentary photographer and filmmaker, I found so much of my work to really just be what I can do independently with very little money, having a background of what my background is, kind of having worked in Hollywood and now kind of putting some of those production values into more kind of conscious projects. But, you know, when you're limited on budget, there's only so much you can do, but you also have so much more creative flexibility. So it's the perfect dynamic of if you have had some kind of inner development on yourself, and then you're also an artist or a creative, you can put that development into what you create. Because I think that's ultimately what it's really about. It's about kind of being in service to the others, you know, kind of to serve what some people in kind of ancient traditions called like the great work, right? So you create stuff that is kind of in service to humanity that kind of also serves the great work, which is essentially helping out your fellow brothers and sisters. So rather than just making this kind of, you know, shallow, vapid, you know, corporate crap, or this kind of, you know, like just exploitive, you know, nothing really, no substance to its stuff, which I think a lot of material also ends up being when people are just borrowing themes from other things that they've seen and making more, you know, watered down versions of them.
But isn't it hard in Hollywood because there's writers and there's producers, there's investors, and they all have a voice and an opinion. And at the end of the day, for Hollywood, the bottom line is to make money. And you have to really do whatever sells. And sometimes movies or TV series, even, their storylines get changed because it wouldn't sell as much tickets in the box office, right?
Yeah, or they think that that's the case. You know, usually when you give a small core team of people or even one person a creative vision on something, even if the budget's high, if that is a very well-balanced person that has a clear vision for something, you can get amazing things that are of originality. But usually it's like when there's so many cooks in the kitchen, there's a saying that says like, he who has the gold makes the rules. So the more money you take, the more you generally do have to kind of compromise on things. But,
Right.
We're at the time we're recording this, I'm the kind of co-creator of this independently made documentary series called Shamans of the Global Village, which I've made with my dear friend and colleague, Rak Razam, who's a journalist and commentator and shamanic facilitator, as well as our executive producer, Michael Weesey, who runs Divine Arts, the publishing group. But, this is something that we've made for extremely little money, and it's something that we're very proud of as kind of a paradigm-crushing piece of shamanic media that couldn't really have been made in any other way, just because it's so, I almost want to say leading edge. It's like, I don't think that you'd see it blasted across the front of like Netflix or Amazon quite yet.
I think it could be, though. That's the thing. I think I can see it in front of Netflix because Netflix has been taking a lot of risks lately, with series like Stranger Things and, different like Black Mirror. That's a great one. So I think that I could definitely see Netflix picking up Shamans of the Global Village, but then probably not yet because it is kind of esoteric and it is kind of out there and the experiences are real, so it could freak some people out, right?
Exactly. And, we filmed numerous things in it that basically have never been filmed before, or at least not nearly in the way that you're seeing them on screen. So we're extremely proud of it. I mean, it's kind of the culmination of Rak and I's life's work thus far. And, Rak is essentially the host of the show and has been a commentator on ayahuasca culture for over a decade and has done a lot of work like actually helping people through their kind of multidimensional journeys in ayahuasca space, and is such a beautiful kind of poetic speaker in terms of the delivery of the material. So he's great as kind of the host of the show because it's the perfect kind of culmination of he has a podcast called In a Perfect World. And so he's perfect and on his podcast, he talks a lot with people in the community and the kind of entheogenic and psychedelic community. So as the host of the show, he's perfect to do everything on screen. And he knows so much about the material. And then kind of with my background, just trying to be somebody that's coming out of Hollywood, trying to make more kind of conscious content as an independent filmmaker, I kind of do everything behind the scenes and kind of bring a lot of the production value to it. So I think you've never really seen anything that's had this level of kind of production value with this also deep substance of, some of the kind of themes and wisdom that you wouldn't necessarily see in anything mainstream. It's kind of more for a documentary realm because, yes, what is real is oftentimes so much more impressive and overwhelming than anything you can create from fiction. And there's amazing things that we filmed that I'm just so flabbergasted as to how synchronistically, perfectly they turned out. And I think it's something that's very much worth visiting because it's a dynamic where it couldn't have been done in any other way, really, without this kind of like these people that have had this kind of background or this development or like through the networks or the connections that Rak knows. It's a very perfect piece of media that I think kind of we're very proud of. So we're very proud of it. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what, man? Originally, that was what I was trying to do with Psychedelic Milk. Like in the very, very beginning, my idea of it was to, take a video camera with a camera guy and go on these psychedelic trips in all over the world and try to, experience different things, meet different people. But I realized that I have no background in, in filming or in editing, and I don't know anybody in this field. So I just kind of did the podcast, which was what I knew better. But then you guys are actually doing it. You guys are actually going out there and trying different psychedelics and spiritual traditions and meeting different shamans and whatnot. And I think that's really, really cool, man. Not only is it cool to the audience that's watching it, who you are bringing on a journey with, it's cool for you guys as well, who is actually experiencing the experiences. How cool is that, man?
Yeah, it's super cool. And kind of, the slick pitch line for the show is to kind of come on an intimate journey into the world of modern global shamanism with essentially Western practitioners and see never before filmed footage of ancient medicine practices. And the concept is that each episode will follow a specific medicine person working with a specific medicine. And the first pilot episode features Dr. Octavio Redding, who's a Western trained general practitioner that's worked in Mexico. He's a Mexican citizen, and he's come to discover the lineage of the Sonoran Desert Toad. So the first episode focuses on Octavio, and we shot it in Mexico in 2015 in and around the Sonoran Desert. But, creating each episode is like kind of creating a feature-length documentary film. So far, only the first pilot episode exists, with the idea to kind of continue making these things, at least hopefully one additional episode per year if we can get the funds raised for it. But as something that's being done independently, it's tough, because it's like every episode we're making essentially a full documentary, which is to get anything done is astronomically difficult. And, it's kind of such a community-based project where the only way that it will continue going is if we kind of have the support of the community and people that are just kind of interested in seeing it or sharing it.
Right. And I think it's real interesting because for the most part, ayahuasca is dominating the psychedelic realm right now. Everybody's talking about ayahuasca, going to Peru, and, there's a million different ayahuasca retreats now, and that's what everybody's focused on. But you guys actually did a different thing where you guys went to Mexico to trip with a toad. And I think that's badass because it is not really talked about. There's only one other person that's doing it that I know of. I think that's Hamilton Morris from Vice, and he tripped with the toad. And I watched that a couple of years ago, and from what I remember, he didn't really have a transcendental experience. I think he felt kind of sick, and he was on a boat, and he was tripping out pretty hard, but it wasn't really transcendental in any shape or form. It was just like, oh shit, like this is happening. I feel really heavy, and he felt really sick. What was that like for you? Because I know you tripped on the toad too, right?
Yeah, well, basically, as the director of the show, because it's being independently made, it's just like I'm essentially serving as the director and the actual cinematographer. So I did experience the toad medicine at the very end. The episode concludes in a ceremony on this really beautiful, amazing, iconic island, which is the largest island off the coast of Mexico, called Shark Island. And the episode concludes in this, what is essentially a toad medicine ceremony. And at the very end of the filming of the episode, even as we were losing the light and we had shot this just absolutely some of the most incredible stuff that I'd been very honored to ever capture, I did experience the toad medicine, which was absolutely, yes. It's so beyond life-changing that it's like, it's so translinguistic that you can't even language it. Like, I know a lot of themes of any sort of plant or earth-based medicine can not even put into a linguistic box. But the thing that's amazing and interesting about 5-methoxy-NN-dimethyltryptamine, which is essentially what the toad medicine is that it's such a profound and life-changing sacrament that I think RAC chose to focus the first episode on that specific sacrament because it's kind of like the end-all be-all, and it's very much, for most people that have a full release dose of it, it's a very much a white light tunnel-based dynamic, or at least an energetic overexposure, melt into the kind of galactic Large Hadron Collider of hyperspace dynamic. And, for what essentially is, there's two types of DMT. One is NN-DMT, and 5-methoxy-NN-dimethyltryptamine is the other DMT, which is very different. And, ayahuasca, the component in ayahuasca is an NN-DMT component, which is typically very visual, but 5-MeO-DMT is quite different, and it's such a profound experience that it's almost like a life initiation to have the experience. And what we've found, and what RAC's done a lot of talking about, is that after you have the sacrament, you typically will exhibit characteristics that you go through during this absolutely profound life-changing experience later on other sacraments. And I think the reason why we kind of chose to do the pilot episode of the show on almost the most profound and amazing sacrament was just like, well, let's start it off with a bang, let's just go to the very top. Because Octavio, who's the, practitioner of it that we focus on in the show, he describes it as basically like the center of the X, or RAC describes it as the star on top of the Christmas tree of entheogens for how absolutely amazing and profound and powerful it is. And, it's by no means recreational stuff. And that's really reflected in the footage, that you can see these people that go through this absolutely life-changing experience, and you take it in smokable form, but the experience varies in time. It can either be as short as, mine was a very low-dose, short experience, and it was probably over in 5 minutes, but it was still the most profound experience of my entire life.
Wow.
But in 5 minutes, it's like boom and done. But at the same time, it's like it can take as long as about an hour for some people, depending upon dosage. And, the effects very much do vary. But yeah, I mean, that right there is just kind of the thing that's so profound about this show is I'm learning that not only is it about making the show, it's about the life experience that you get out of the show, just because of the nature of the amazing material that we're covering.
How do you think people back in the day found out about this toad and decided to smoke? Because, I mean, you scrape some boils from the toad and the liquid comes out, right? And then you're supposed to smoke that liquid. Am I right?
Yeah. So basically, if obviously outside of seeing the actual episode, which we show all this in the initial episode, there was a Vice special on Octavio from a few years back where they also show this. So maybe we can link to that, or if anybody just wants to search out like Octavio Redding Vice, you'll see the footage of how it's done. But yeah, I mean the toad is the Bufo alvarius Colorado River toad. It's also, the name of it has recently changed because I think it's now called the Ancilius alvarius, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, toad, and it's indigenous primarily to the Sonoran Desert of Mexico. And, this is a very interesting sacrament because it's pretty much the only entheogen, to my knowledge, that comes out of an actual animal. All other sacraments pretty much come out of plants, right, or plant extracts. And Mexico is really interesting because it's like ground zero for entheogens. So I think that Mexico, with all of its struggles now, in times of the past, was very much a much more kind of galactivated place because, Mexico is like home to peyote and salvia divinorum, psilocybin mushrooms, and this toad, this Bufo alvarius toad. So in the past, I think the way that it was probably discovered many thousands of years ago is because people would catch the toads and then essentially throw them on the fire. And they have these glands on the back of their neck and their legs that look like these big zit burn boils, and you essentially pop the zits. But at the time, I think when they were catching these toads, they probably were throwing them on the fire just to eat them. And of course, then they subsequently would cook the medicine, which is really the venom that's in these glands, which is probably a defense mechanism so other animals don't eat it. And it would essentially, create an activation because all the smoke in the cave would be essentially psychedelic smoke, right? And that's what a lot of Native American smokehouses and smoke rooms are, is literally taking a sacrament as a group and just breathing in the fire of it. So it's interesting, the very last scene of the episode, we do that on screen where Octavio pours some of the toad flakes. The flakes are typically popped and then, they gush onto this sheet of glass like a big pimple, and then they're dried, and when they're dried, they look very much like fish flakes, that you'd feed out of fish in a fish tank. So in the scene of the episode, Octavio sprinkles these, quite a large number of fish flakes on the fire, and we all had this, massive activation from it after our ceremony. This was a day after the main ceremony. So it's an amazing sacrament for sure. And it's something that I could definitely talk about for a long time.
Are these toads, are they legal in the US? Because that's one of the biggest questions that I get from this podcast is people email me or message me and they're like, hey man, do you know where I can find DMT? I'm like, I'm sorry, man. Can't help you.
Yeah. Well, that's the larger thing. It's like, I think in terms of a kind of larger spiritual sense, if you're ready for these things, they may eventually find you. Right, and we all need to kind of engage our will to seek things out. So it's not like you can just be sitting on the couch eating potato chips and then you're going to get a knock on the door or something. But you do need to kind of, if you feel the call to some sort of shamanic medicine, or you feel the call to one of these things, and there's just something within you that's probably likely your subconscious kind of ringing or telling you something, then I've come to really realize that these things kind of end up finding you if you kind of engage your will for them. So the short answer to that question is that the toad medicine, which is essentially 5-MeO DMT, Octavio does actually have a slight separation between what is synthetic 5-MeO versus the toad medicine. He feels that there's debate about this, but Octavio feels that the toad medicine is even a more high-end kind of pure form of this sacrament. But to answer your question, it is illegal in 7 countries, but the countries that it is legal in, it's kind of a gray area of legality, right? Where it's not really, it's almost ahead of the curve where the scheduling of the actual sacrament isn't necessarily in a completely illegal box or completely legal box. So these types of things are very, they're not recreational, and they really should be done in kind of a ceremonial context in a proper container. And that's the whole lineage of kind of what we're talking about in the show, is that, these are indigenous people across the globe have essentially used these things for millennia to heal, illuminate, and connect them to the web of life. So this sacrament, was very much, and we go into this in the episode, very much likely used in ancient Mesoamerican cultures. And if you look on the art of a lot of that stuff, I mean, the toads are just absolutely saturated all over a lot of old, Mayan and Aztec art. So it's very likely that this sacrament is, much like Terence McKenna talked about with the mushroom, could be part of our evolution. I mean, Octavio feels that this sacrament was very much a part of the cultural advancement in terms of moving us forward in consciousness for hundreds of thousands of years in ancient Mesoamerica. So to answer your question, it's kind of something that if you do feel the call to this type of thing, it's to be done in a very respectful ceremonial context, because it's not something that you just necessarily want to do on the couch in your scuzzy Chicago apartment.
Because I was thinking, man, I could just have a pet toad in my living room, and whenever I want to have some DMT, just scrape some boils and here we go, we blast off, right?
Well, you could, but I mean, the toads are, there's issues with the toads in terms of their natural habitat being threatened, and, to not harvest the toads, and to, not to go out there and kind of, we talk about this in the show, to just not go out there and, kind of try and go toad hunting yourself, because it's not, especially in Mexico, it's because of the kind of current state of Mexico, a lot of the areas where the toads is narco drug territory. So it's very not wise to do that. And you should be doing it this is kind of the key thing that we try and highlight. We're going to try and keep as a theme throughout the entire show, is the respect of the indigenous cultures with the medicines, right? Because indigenous cultures have kept the wisdom of kind of shamanic medicines for so long, because they kind of weren't as co-opted by the machine as the industrial first world had it. So it's something that we're going to try and do with every episode, to have the person that we're highlighting. And a lot of the show is talking about how somebody in the West has kind of felt the call to becoming a shamanic practitioner or medicine person, and has had the approval and lineage through the indigenous community, right? So has been trained properly by indigenous people or the wise elders to be a facilitator of this medicine, because ultimately you only really heal you. Nobody can heal you ultimately except for you. So these medicines, regardless of whatever they are, they're catalysts for you healing yourself. So it would not be wise to keep the toads in captivity. And Octavio is very much speaks about keeping the toads healthy and in their natural habitat. Right. Because also, the thing that's so amazing about the medicine is that it's so regenerative that, these toads can be, if they're kept in their natural habitat, and they only come out, it's like 2 months out of the year, a small percentage of the year, 2 or 3 months after the rainy season in the Sonoran Desert. So it's a very small window when they come out, but they can be essentially milked over and over again, right? So it's a regenerative, natural medicine from a completely, source that is not made in a lab, that is absolutely life-changingly profound. So It's a beautiful thing if you kind of keep it in its natural state.
And the toad lives, right, after you smoke its boils and chemicals. You don't actually kill the toad, right?
No, you don't harm the toads. And, we talk about this in the episode, too, because we show a night where we actually did go out toad hunting. And Octavio had a toad from one of his previous times where he had extracted the medicine, and he was going out to essentially then release that toad from the previous extraction while going out to get new medicine. So the toads actually really kind of like the process, it seems like. If you're respectful to the animal and, you honor the animal, and you are extracting the medicine from it in a way that isn't hurting the animal, they seem to really just kind of chill out and take it. It's a weird dynamic where it's almost like, from an evolutionary standpoint, these toads are designed to kind of give us this medicine. So it really makes you think, and they kind of rather enjoy the process of having their giant burn boils popped.
That's really cool, man. It makes me wonder if they're used to it from the Mayans, right? Like they used to do it all the time, kind of like dogs get domesticated. These toads, they know when humans are capturing them, they're actually safe and they'll let them go. They just want the boils, which they probably don't want anyways, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, who's to say? But it's interesting because if you look at some of the lineage of ancient cultures, especially in Mesoamerica, and I'm very much as kind of a documentary filmmaker that's starting to cover this material. I'm not a world expert on it, and I'm learning more about it as well. But in terms of the history of it, it's quite fascinating how they had a lot of things that look like in ancient Aztec temples or Mayan temples that were designed to kind of accommodate to the toads. Like, you know how they almost have, when you see like a chicken egg hatchery or something where they have a dynamic where there's like free range chickens and, you know, you go to get the eggs. They had things like that in ancient cultures. And you can see it in some of the art where it almost looks like a storage facility that's designed to kind of store the toads or, you know, keep the toads in a somewhat natural habitat, but also have them with the ability to kind of be easily accessible to the culture of the time.
Yeah, I'm looking at some Mayan art right now, and there's a lot of art on these toads. I don't know if it's specifically this type of toad, but there's a lot of toad art, and you know, there's not a lot of cultures that pay its respects to toads. You know what I mean? And I think it's really interesting that there's a lot of art on these toads, and it has to mean something. It has to mean that they were probably tripping really hard on these toads back in the day, and you know, they found something really profound in these animals, and they had to make art about them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing about, you know, these transcendent experiences that give you essentially downloads from somewhere else. You know, I mean, you could argue that you're getting information from what some people called like the Akashic field, or what I just read a very interesting deep old text called the Emerald Tablet. And in the Emerald Tablet, they talk about this thing called the Halls of Amenti, or, you know, some other people refer to it as like the Akashic, where you essentially, you know, access something and then you get data, which anytime I've had an experience has just been like profound thoughts popping into your head.
Right.
But I think if you're getting that type of stuff, even if it was happening 100,000 years ago in some ancient culture, and the Eleusinian Mysteries talked a lot about, or were a lot, that's what was going on essentially at Eleusis, was they were taking, it was 2,500 plus years in ancient Greece of a mystery tradition where they were taking a sacrament that basically was doing just that. It was giving them some sort of amazing information, and it was part of a ritualistic context where for a spiritual practice, they had this kind of they had this catalyst that would activate you. And much of the kind of spiritual traditions of today, which sadly have kind of diluted into what we call mainstream religion, have lost the connection with those entheogenic sacraments. So when you look at that ancient art, I mean, yeah, when you're having such an absolute profound experience that's just flooding you with these gnosis moments or these kind of kensho moments, it's a no-brainer that you blast it all over your art, because art is such a reflection of what we subconsciously see, because the subconscious mind communicates to us in symbols. So when you see kind of a amazing person, and I think we're all much more creative than we think, and I think we have our creativity smashed out of us by negative systems, but when you see somebody creating something amazing that's of kind of a creative fueling, and then they've also had some kind of development maybe in some sort of astral space, it's like that's a no-brainer that hugely influences your creativity in art if you kind of are doing it in a again, I always try and go back to the proper respect, proper container. You know, of course you can do these things on a Friday night, but they're not intended originally to be recreational, and what you kind of put into them with the amount of attainment that you have as a person that's always working on yourself, or what respect you put into them, the more you'll get out of them. Right. So I think in an ancient culture like that, when you saw, you know, even you see these things as kind of, they're so profound that it's a no-brainer that these would be catalysts for what you see in the art. And a lot of art in Europe and Egypt too, you know, a lot of that is so encoded with astrotheology and symbolism because of these kind of mystery traditions.
Right. Yeah.
That it's all over a lot of Renaissance art as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the most common things that a person would do after a trip with psychedelics or some enlightening, profound dream is to put the dream or put the trip back into our context, whether it's art or in YouTube videos or just talking about it. you call your friend, hey man, I just had the craziest experience ever. This happened to me. Or you put it into writing or art, or, you talk about it on a podcast. It is a form of expression. It is a form of art. And it is a no-brainer that we would do that, because we, as human beings, we want to capture that moment. We want to hold on to it as long as possible for us to remember what happened to us, because it was so important. And I think that, like you said, the Mayans had it, the Europeans had it, the Egyptians definitely had it, because I've seen Egyptian art when I took DMT. And, to be honest, I'm not very into the Egyptian side of things. Like, I'm not like really deep into Egyptian culture or ancient Egypt and things like that. I've seen it before, like in pop culture, or read it in some books, but I'm not like entrenched in ancient Egypt. But I saw that on my DMT trip, and I was like, wow, that is amazing. And after the trip, I tried to remember what I saw, and I try to draw it on my notebook just to kind of make sense of it all. And I think it makes a lot of sense that these Mayans were tripping hardcore on these toads and had some incredible download of knowledge. And so they, in order to pay respects to the toads, where they got it from, like they made art about the toads. And I think that's really, really cool. And there's not another, I don't know if there's any other culture that, I think that actually, you know what, man, the Chinese, they had some toad art, because whenever I visit like these museums or these antique stores, there is a toad that's always present, and the toad is holding a coin, and the toad only has like 3 legs, but I never knew what that means. And I think they could have been tripping on toads too, man. Like, who knows, man? But
yeah, and I mean, a lot of art, whether it's in the West or the East, I suspect stems from a lot of kind of multidimensional experiences, whether or not they've been had, endogenously or by taking some sort of sacrament in the past through some sort of, shamanistic, indigenous spiritual practice. But, like, for example, when you see dragons and stuff in Asia, I suspect that a lot of those kind of reptilian shapes and things are probably because, one day we may find that there is DMT in some sort of reptile in Asia that was, known about, and the knowledge was lost and forgotten. Right. So that type of thing. I think a lot of that art has information in it that one day we'll come to remember things that were once forgotten. But, one thing that you hinted on, dude, that I should just kind of clarify is that I believe Hamilton Morris is his name. I think that episode of Vice that he was doing with a frog, that is another. I should clarify, there is another frog in the rainforest that's has a sacrament in it called combo. Mm-hmm. And this is the frog where typically you see it. It's a smaller frog, and they'll tie it up and they'll essentially extract venom from its back. And then you inject that into your bloodstream by kind of doing a micro cut on yourself. Right. So the Bufo alvarius toad is something completely different from combo. And I don't know where the urban legend of licking toads came from. I think that's just kind of the, stoners in the trailer parks making up shit versus what is actually the real history of the sacrament. But because sometimes it's like I realize that, very few people have access to this medicine because, it's a very special and rare medicine. And I know that there are things these days like ayahuasca that have, gained so much popularity. And it's good in the sense that it gets people kind of thinking outside the box. And it's great I agree with the kind of, there's people from kind of mystery traditions that think that just tripping out with shamans doesn't ultimately get you anywhere. Really, we're in this realm for a reason. And I understand that. But I also agree with the kind of Terence McKenna mindset where if you've never had a psychedelic experience, it's like totally cradle to grave a virgin, right? So I think it's good that people are interested in these things, and they can be huge catalysts for expanding consciousness in a very short amount of time. And so that's the beauty of them. And that's kind of the thing that it's nice that people are interested in these things. And that's one thing that we're trying to always highlight with the show is that if you're interested in these things, if you're interested in toad medicine, if you're interested in what 5-MeO-DMT is all about, what it looks like, how it's administered, what the history of it, what the lineage of it is, and if you're brave enough to be initiated into it, what that looks like when somebody takes it on camera, this is the show for you. And that's the idea with each sacrament, as we hopefully can make it to a full season. We go through pretty much each sacrament there is out there. So that's kind of the concept anyway. But one thing about the show that's really tricky is that all of this stuff ultimately is, yes, what's called esoteric, right? Which essentially means the inside. And esoteric is ultimately everything that's outside of the five senses, right? So when you have a psychedelic experience, that can be a very esoteric experience because it's internal and it's about your own journey. And we will never really be able to fully show that internal journey on screen. So that's something that we're really conscious of in the making of the show, is that, you know, here we are showing footage of people smoking the toad medicine and essentially flopping around. And if you don't have proper context or understanding on the material, it can look very scary and very, challenging, which it certainly is. But when you have the kind of proper understanding of the back history of it and know that it's being done in the proper respect and setting, what is you essentially having this convulsive flopping around on the outside is your most internal, beautiful, life-changing experience.
So yeah, how do you convey that message to the audience? Because it is one of the most difficult things as a podcaster to convey that psychedelic experience, that transcendental beauty to the audience when you're smoking something or when you're doing mushrooms or ayahuasca or whatever the case may be. It's very hard to put it into words. A lot of times, like, you have these crazy thoughts and feelings that evokes from inside of you through these psychedelics, and it's quite impossible to put it into words. The moment you put it into words, it becomes something else, because language is very limiting, and you're basically putting that transcendental, godlike experience into the words that we have, which can't describe that experience at all. So you're really downplaying the experience to a certain extent. Whenever I'm talking about experiences that I've had or other people have had, I'm really like downplaying whatever happened to them or me, and it's really hard to translate that into word format. How do you guys do that with your documentary?
Well, it's funny you say this, because this is a funny dynamic. This is something I'll say. In the psychedelic community, I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's these people called puffers. I don't know if you've heard this term, which basically means they use overly flowery and inflated language. Right, yeah. So the classic example of this, what they're trying to essentially do is talk like Terence McKenna, right? Because McKenna was such a poet that he could really... You can never honor any of these experiences, especially something with like the toad medicine, which is just, again, it's not even a psychedelic experience. It's not even a psychedelic trip. You do it for either healing or for the expansion of consciousness, and it's absolutely an initiation into a higher state. So it's not recreational, and it's not to be underestimated or disrespected in any way. And I'm sure that your audience is sophisticated enough to totally understand that. But the thing about it is that when you get to that kind of state of, it's hard to even language the experience after you come back from it. And that's what integration is so helpful with, when you have an experience with a practitioner that's all about helping you ground and reintegrate. It's almost like you can't even honor the experience by trying to put it into words. But Rak, I will give my dear friend and colleague and host of the show, Rak Razam, as... I wouldn't necessarily call him a puffer, even though he does use this amazing... and you know what I mean by puffer. It's like you hear this language where people are talking about like the fractal rhinestone pine cones of holographic infinity or something like that. And it's annoying. It's annoying. And it can be annoying, but it can also be, if you're doing it in a way where it's great that people aren't just accepting the old paradigms in terms of language. For so many years, it's like people would just fucking take the language that they were dished to them by CNN or, our old kind of political operating systems. And I always, when I was growing up listening to garbage things that I don't even pay attention to anymore, I was always so wondering why aren't they talking about this? Or why is the language so limited? Why is it such a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of what is really going on is what's being vocalized? So it's good that people in the community are trying to use language like, the vibrational matrix of the source, or the, unlocking the chakras to, blah, blah, blah. Like, all that stuff is great in the sense that you're just trying to, you've had some experiences that are zooming you out and expanding you and allowing you to try and explore and vocalize things better, which is the side of philosophy that, you can argue in one sense people are just kind of sitting around philosophizing about stuff. And I'm all about the kind of life wisdom that you actually apply to your life. But, with all that said, Rack is such a poetic dude that I think he does a really great job of trying to explain and communicate these experiences to others, whether it's, as the host of the show or in some of his material, that I think he's kind of the perfect person to kind of help vocalize that, because he definitely has that same thing that McKenna had, where he's just such a beautiful speaker at communicating some of this to other people without getting lost in the kind of word salad of, just trying to get up in front of an audience and wow them with big adjectives and things.
Yeah, I think those things are kind of like word trickery. Like they're words that fortune tellers would tell you because you don't understand them. So you try your best to fit into your mode of thinking, and it fits somewhere in the middle. So I think, it's really, I don't know, man. I think there's definitely a lot of them in the psychedelic community, and I try not to talk to those people as much as I can, but it's hard to avoid sometimes because
right.
I think, man, that's one of the things that about the psychedelic community is that people in this field or this community, some of them, they feel like they're better than other people because they have had that external knowledge. You know what I mean? Like they've had that download from the DMT gods, or they've had that transcendental experience in Peru, and they come back to the States and they're like, man, I am on top of the world. I'm better than you. They don't say it, but they definitely feel like that. And they use words that go right over our heads. And it's like, hey, what are you trying to portray here? You're just like one of us. And that's one of the clear signs that healing wasn't enough, because this is what I find. The higher you go into this meditative state, into this psychedelic journey, into, I don't want to use the word enlightenment, but I'll use the word enlightenment. The lower you are, which means that the more grounded you'll be, the less important you think you are, the more sense of humor you'll have, the less serious you are about your life, about your work, about your identity. But then sometimes the opposite happens. And I'm kind of wondering if the healing was enough, or was there enough medicine, or did the shaman do enough work? Was the community that took the ayahuasca or whatever drug you had with you pure enough or good enough? So that's one of the most cringeworthy things about the psychedelic world is you have to talk to people like that, and they think that they're some spiritual badass, some spiritual gangster. But in reality, you're no different than you and I. And it's one of the most frustrating things that I'm sure you deal with it a lot. And especially when you go all over the world and you talk to different people and different communities, and it's got to be hard, man.
Yeah, well, the more you learn, the less you realize you know. Right. And however you get there, I mean, I was talking with somebody recently that's a friend that I was at a workshop with that says that he can have amazing kind of astral experiences simply by, listening to didgeridoos. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's actually, a didgeridoo in the room or if he's playing some sort of recording for it. But however you get there, it's like the reason why you would want to have some of these experiences, and this is kind of what we highlight for why, you'd want to take the toad medicine again, is that you either do it for healing or the expansion of consciousness, or both. And healing doesn't just mean, I had a traumatic childhood and, I went through some horrible stuff and I need healing that way, or that I have a physical ailment. And, these different medicines are good for different ailments or different things. And, mushrooms I know typically are kind of very alien and cosmic, and while ayahuasca is very much kind of this, Gaian mother, and the toad is very much this kind of white melt into the all. But whatever kind of flavor you happen to be synchronistically lucky enough to come across, that healing is ultimately there to bring you more into wholeness, because what wholeness is realizing that everything that we are in this kind of material realm culturally is not right. I mean, we have this amazing first world modernity that we think is normal, but in no way is it ultimately a reflection of what authentic human culture is, with our kind of hack and slash consumerist society that's trashing the planet for all of our corporate profits. So anybody that's probably living in the Western world or the industrialized first world and thinks that, a city is a logical way to, have people, or to organize massive amounts of people. These are interesting experiments, I should say, that we're going through now. But a lot of the times when you have such a transcendental experience, the healing element of that is just realizing that, I'll use a line from the John Carpenter film, They Live, which is that you've been living in an artificially induced state of consciousness, which resembles sleep, right? Or you've kind of flushed your matrix pod and you're realizing that it was all an illusion. Mm-hmm. So when it's more of a mental realization that there's so much more to reality than what you've even perceived. And that is kind of the expansion of consciousness mixed with the healing element. So those are things that after you've had that experience, I know what you mean. If you are not as developed on yourself, and I use this word attainment, which is a word that I oftentimes use, which basically means like how much you've essentially worked on yourself in this realm, because we're in this realm for a reason. These things are kind of like mirrors for your attainment level. So if you're kind of a not very developed person and you happen to have a sacrament experience and you come back, you might turn into a bit of an egomaniac, or you might be kind of on your high horse. But ultimately, if you have done development on yourself and you kind of come back, it's all about what you then do with it while you're back here, right? Because we're here. You could argue that this gets into kind of a really esoteric standpoint, but you can argue that our souls have essentially transited to this realm for a reason. And I'm always, very much an advocate of, again, proper set and setting, proper respect for taking these things. But if you have the experience where you can expand your consciousness in a very short amount of time, that's great. But ultimately, what do you do with that when you're back? And how do you live your life when you're back? So when I see somebody, not acting very much in honor after a sacrament, I'd say they've got more work to do here in this realm before they go off and have any more kind of astral journeys to get downloads from other places.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely important, man. What do you do with the trip afterwards? That is where it begins. That is where it starts. A lot of people have this mentality where, I'm going to Peru, I'm taking ayahuasca, and everything will be all gravy after that. And they think it's a one pill fix all. It's a very Western mind type of thinking where you take the Tylenol, take the Advil, and you set it and forget it, man. You're good after that. So there's a lot of work to be done, man, after the experience is over. That is when it starts, and your life starts after that. And it's kind of like a rebirth process where you die in the ceremony in many ways, and you come back to this realm as a different person, and that is when the healing begins. But a lot of people, they just want to, it's a type of spiritual materialism where, they go down there to South America, have a transcendental experience, and kind of just forget it afterwards. And they kind of make it into their own identity. Say, hey, I went to Peru to took ayahuasca, so I must be a different person. I must be a better person now. And there's no more work to be done. Maybe I'll do it again. But when I'm sitting here at home or at work or I'm driving, I don't have to have any kind of mindfulness about life, about the world, because I've already done my work in South America. And I think that's a very dangerous way of thinking. And I think many cases, it is the shaman's responsibility to really follow up on the people that they've had ceremonies with. But it's very hard nowadays, especially for ayahuasca, because these retreat centers, they take in so many people. So it's really impossible to stay in touch with that many people throughout the year and ask them about how they're doing when you're accepting hundreds of people at a time and your job is, overwhelmed, basically. So I think the job of the shamans is really important, man, because they're pretty much a doctor for this medicine. They're prescribing you this medicine, and a good doctor would follow up on you and ask you how you're doing, and maybe prescribe more medicine, maybe back up on the medicine a little bit. But as far as I know, for now in Peru with ayahuasca, you go take ayahuasca and you're done. And if you're lucky, you get a few emails back and forth, but for the most part, you're on your own.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, that's the role of the shaman in the 21st century, as these medicines are very commoditized now, as we have to kind of, suffer through our current capitalist ways where, there's a resurging interest of these things, and then supply and demand is something to definitely be concerned about with the deforestation and the over harvesting of the Banisteriopsis copy vine for ayahuasca and things like that. These are huge concerns as more people experience these things. And there was talk about how Maria Sabina talked about how when the mushroom was first discovered, after Gordon Wasson had experiences with it and brought Westerners to it, that the kind of whole flavor and feeling of it changed, right? So indigenous cultures are very protective of these medicines because of kind of the imperial legacy of Westerners kind of coming in and co-opting things, which is totally understandable. But, as we kind of live in the kind of current times that we're in, which are crazy and foobar in a lot of ways, but also the species is kind of slowly, it seems like certain nodes on the network are switching on and understanding that we can't keep doing things in the unsustainable ways that we have been doing them. Integration is a huge part of that, and you need the community. And at the beginning of this talk, I don't know if that'll make it into the chat, but we talked a bit about fellowship, which is your kind of tribe or finding the others or the community. You need that fellowship after you've had an experience to kind of talk to about and to reground with and to reintegrate with. And that's something that Octavio, the highlight, who's the highlight of the first episode, he very much is still learning about, because that's been a criticism of him, is that, it's like a boom, 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 one after another. And the toad medicine is so powerful that you typically don't do it in a circle as a group. You certainly can in a smaller dosage, but typically it's such a blast off that you do it one by one. So for example, on the ceremony that we had for the episode, it's like, one person went and then it's like, they're done, boom, on to the next person. And that doesn't give them proper time to kind of reground and reintegrate. So that's something that we're very conscious of. And our dear friend of the show, whose name's Dave, who is a kind of our reoccurring guest for the show, is somebody that, as he's felt the call as kind of a new medicine person in the 21st century, he's very much learned from the negative aspects of some of the other toad practitioners about a way to be very much more sitting and present with somebody. And you use the kind of term mindfulness, sitting with them, even if it takes like an hour or two after their experience, and just reintegrating and re-coming back to this realm, giving them the time to kind of really be present to that and not just like a boom, 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 moved on to another person. And that's part of why a container, and a container is like you doing a sacrament with a medicine person that's a very honorable person. That's a key part of like that, holding that space and having that container, is not just doing it within this kind of willy-nilly dynamic where people are coming and going, giving each kind of patient the full time to express themselves and to kind of reintegrate themselves. And of course, it can be weeks and weeks of reintegration ultimately. So RAC, for example, has, a community of people that are all the people that he's helped in their ayahuasca journeys, where, there's a community, there's like a Facebook support group and these types of things. And there's communities online for that. So it's nice when you've actually continued communicating with people that you might have gone on that journey with, because that's huge. That's a key part of like the fellowship of when we're back here. And I think a huge part of our spiritual growth, dude, is not at all so much what we do when we have these experiences, but how we live our lives when we're back here. As I gave that kind of original reference to your home and your work and your fellowship, it's like how you balance those things when you're back, for sure.
Yeah, we definitely need it, man. We need a fellowship for us to discuss these topics, these esoteric topics that we oftentimes internalize, and we don't talk to anybody else about it, and it gets lost. And I think that it is really crucial for us to have like an open format, maybe like a forum or a Facebook group or something, for us to put it out there. But the problem with that is that psychedelic community we talked about earlier, some people could be pretentious, some people could be like narcissistic, and you're gonna have that stuff, and it's really hard to avoid it sometimes. Like, I did this Wim Hof method thing for about 10 weeks last year, and when you join the program, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's like this code, it's like a breathing program, and
extreme environment,
right? So I joined the thing because I paid, I don't know, like $100, $200 for it. And then the first thing they tell you to do is to join their Facebook group. And basically in it, you talk to so many people that are involved with this program. Some people are beginners just like me. Some people are on week 10. Some people are doing it for life, and you can ask them questions. They'll share stories with you. They'll share tips with you. And I think that's really important in this space that we are in. But also it's really difficult because a lot of these substances, they're illegal. Like DMT, like ayahuasca, psilocybin, LSD, everything we have is basically illegal. So when we have like an open format like that, people are not going to risk their identities and their jobs and to discuss these things openly. And I think that's a real shame. And, you know, I think that the fellowship would definitely benefit the psychedelic community a lot more than any other community out there, because it is so important. I think it is what's missing in our current society these days is we don't have a spiritual practice. We have these churches and groups that mean nothing. They're all about money and they're all about power, and there's no spirituality in religion in this day and age. And I think that we need to bring it back into our society, and we can talk about it openly. And one of the easiest ways to bring spirituality back is through psychedelic drugs and spiritual journeys, but none of that exists in this day and age. I think it's getting a little better than before, but it is still very underground, and it needs to be brought back.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, you can throw around the term spirituality here and there. It ultimately, I think it's a realization and an understanding that we are not so much these, you know, meat bodies that can have an occasional spiritual experience, but more that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And a lot of it ties in with, I've had some recent kind of things in life, some of which came about through the kind of toad medicine experience that was just such a, again, to use this kind of like gnosis moment, you could almost say like a mystical experience, which the definition of is technically like union with the divine. But you kind of wonder, like, when you have something that's so profound that gives you so much information, like why you were given that information. And a lot of my experiences have had corollaries where I've kind of gotten insight as to like what we're in. And for me, it seems like this kind of reality construct that we're in is more or less kind of all a setup. And it's kind of like you could think of as like a learning lab or a training ground. And I almost wouldn't even go to the point where I'd say Earth, Niles will say something totally bonkers on your show. I wouldn't even go to the point of saying that Earth is a planet. I'd almost think of it more as a realm, and to have kind of a spiritualized mind on what we're in and what the spatial model is even, because I've honestly come to learn that so much is backwards in what we think of as kind of the mainstream Wikipedia version of things, the kind of milquetoast McDonald's version of what we're being handed, especially in terms of our history, that I've come to realize that nothing is really what we think other than what you can directly experience for yourself. So that's the beauty of these kind of experiences, is that yeah, you don't have to have blind faith for some sort of, you know, cultural institution hands to you. You just have to have the direct experience. But ultimately, I think we're in this kind of learning lab training ground. And so, yeah, it's like you're here to learn and grow. And that part of that is how you balance and live your life. And if you're acting like a douchebag and you're going off to festivals and you're taking sacraments, and then, like you said, dude, you're not exemplifying an honorable behavior, that means that you've got a lot of work to do here rather than, you know, in other places. And you can drink ayahuasca 1,000 times and it doesn't matter. You might still have an ego, or you might still have, or I should say ego is a defense mechanism. You might still have the negative aspects of being an egomaniac, for example, or, you know, hyper competitiveness, or like, you know, in hyper cutthroat industry, these type of things. But our society is so difficult on people these days because of the way that it's been structured, which I think is not a mistake, which is all about kind of limiting our spiritual growth. And that's a whole kind of deep conversation we could go into, that it's really all about like how living a spiritual life, a lot of people just talk about it and don't so much do it. So it's really about applying things and that's why I'm so into kind of looking at philosophy, which essentially is just philosophia, which is just loving wisdom, applying kind of philosophy to life in terms of how you live your life in a spiritual context, that is realizing that it is all about your individual journey in this kind of learning lab for each of us, right? So that's what a psychedelic experience shows, is that everybody is so different, that everybody's experiences are different. And when we did the show, it's like everybody had, their toad medicine experience, but internally, the esoteric version of what they're going through, there's corollaries between what people experience on their medicines, but each experience is so unique and individual because every person's such an individual that we're all here in our kind of like, I almost use the metaphor of reality being kind of all set up in the sense that it's like the Truman Show, or like almost a mixture between Groundhog Day and the Truman Show, where you could argue that, we may be on these kind of cycles of time that are repeating, or you could argue that, we're here through numerous lives until we get shit right. So everything in your life is an initiation, right? Every challenge that you go through or every struggle that you have, if you put it off, I'm getting very convinced, and this sounds like something that's very influenced from kind of spiritual Eastern practices, that, you may reincarnate here over again and you will face those same challenges again. And only when you overcome those obstacles will you then move on to the next step? Will you then level up? So if, for example, if you have some struggle with family members or something and you don't really address it or deal with it, in the next life, it's probably going to come back around and be there the same. Or if you have some struggle at work and, you leave your job and then all of a sudden at that next job, it's like you've got that same struggle. These are all the secret kind of initiations in this kind of learning lab that we're in, which I think communicates to you through synchronicity and symbolism in the day, and then our dreams at night, because our dreams are much more of an interface for how our minds, help kind of manifest through our subconscious mind what will eventually be. So that's the stuff that is all about really doing that real work and understanding these things and kind of realizing that there's more to reality than we think, and the world's a much more kind of magical and special place than we think. But it's something that only one person at a time will come to really understand and to switch on. And as nodes on the network kind of turn on and switch on to the larger spiritual ecology of the cosmos and what we're in and what we are about and how we're much more powerful, multidimensional beings than we think we really are. We're in this system where we're reduced into these kind of hamster wheel societies and man is turned into a machine where we go to like our kind of shit jobs we don't like every day. These are things that we all have to kind of deal with to make money in the current dynamic, but how you live your life is all about not dealing what other people hand to you, but instead kind of finding your own path and doing your own thing. And I think a lot of that is done through our creativity. So that's maybe something why, dude, you started this podcast is as a creative vessel and also a fellowship vessel, and also something that might hopefully one day turn into somewhat of a work vessel. Yeah. So, these are kind of the pillars that we work on. And no matter how much psychedelics one takes, this is all going to be here when you're back. So I think the astral experiences are good kind of previews to help you kind of level up to the next step in some of these processes. But again, you can do these things through a flotation tank or through meditation. It might take longer, but ultimately it's about that kind of training ground when you're back here to really always kind of work on bettering yourself. And I think that's the true kind of life spirituality that you could talk about as always trying to better yourself. And whatever you kind of say to somebody else is really a reflection. There's a lot of ancient wisdom that talks about as within, so without, and how whatever you ultimately say to somebody else, you're really saying to yourself. Right. So a reflection of that, I like to say, when you look at like kind of the doom prophets of empire, like, for example, you look at some of those kind of like militarized police forces that are shutting down a protest or something. You look at some cop that's in complete SWAT outfit with some automatic weapon and, armor piercing Kevlar and stuff. You shouldn't look at that person with fear. You should look at them and feel sorry for them, because ultimately what they really are internally, esoterically, is a mirror for what they're projecting externally, right? So they're not really a strong, powerful person inside. They're like a little wimpy, weak person inside, and they're externally projecting a reflection of what they really are, right? And then the little medicine woman who's the little 95-year-old Yoda shaman in the jungle who seems just completely bitter and frail, what she really is inside is this fucking amazing, dragon of power. So that's kind of the dynamic that is, you come to realize some of these things, and these are things that some of these experiences show you, but ultimately it's about kind of what you do when you're here, for sure.
That's one of the craziest things about photography. We were talking about it earlier. I don't know if it's going to make the show because it was at the beginning, but when you take a photo, you're really taking a photo of what's going on inside your psyche. That's what I find, because a lot of times people think that this photographer is taking a photo of the outside, and the outside has nothing to do with the person himself or herself. But if you look at a photo, it's directly reflecting the current psyche that photographer is experiencing at the time. The way that he or she, frames the photo, what subjects are in it, the colors. It is directly the representation of what's going on inside a photographer's heart. And I think that's really, really cool, because you're using the outside world to portray exactly what's happening on the inside. And I don't think a lot of people recognize that are not into photography. And, I just picked up photography recently, and I was like, man, this is one of the most meditative activities I can do, because it really forces you to slow down from the busy lives of living in a city. It really forces you to sit down or stand there and to examine really what's happening and kind of just be in the moment. Just really be here while other people are doing their things. You're capturing what they're doing, and you're contemplating on the meaning behind those things and those actions and those landscapes. And it is, man, it is so fucking peaceful, man. Whenever, like on the weekends, I'll take my camera out and I'll just go around the city, and even if I don't take any pictures, it forces me to be in the moment, to be in that mode, in that state of mind. And it is so therapeutic, and it is not very expensive at all, because you have a one-time fee of buying a camera, and then the picture taking part, they're all free, man. And it forces you to go to these places that you would never go before. It forces you to go into nature or other parts of the city where you normally have no reason to go. But now you have a reason to go there, and it puts you into a Zen state. And it's really cool, man. And I think you must feel that a lot, because you're a professional at this and you've been doing this for a while. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, back to the thing of like, you can only really help you and you can only heal you. I mean, Ibogaine is a sacrament that has amazing healing power for an absolutely horrendously difficult, multiple day experience if you are addicted to some sort of horrible narcotic. But that type of thing, you have to engage your own will to want to heal yourself, right? So if you have the kind of will to work on yourself back here as well as there, you will see results, but you have to kind of put it into action yourself. And so I think that anything that we do on our own, especially in terms of an art form, is such a Zen therapeutic kind of extension of that, where photography does that, or even if it's like Monet, painting the water lilies around the chateau. It's like, that's what I love about, as an avid street photographer, which is essentially photographing people candidly on the street. It's something that I do when I'm traveling a lot, and it's something that I very much can do alone, and is very much kind of a Zen thing for me. And I kind of, I put it into kind of this philosophic context, because I always try and, encode wisdom into any of my personal projects, whether it's like my photography or my filmmaking or my kind of, talking to others or doing essays. It's like I always try and encode wisdom into everything I do, but usually that's always done as a soul path, right? Because this spiritual journey, ultimately, you can only really work on yourself. It's like the con of the system is to get you to pay attention to all this stuff out there, and we should be conscious of things that are going on in negative aspects that we're a part of, like in terms of our environmental destruction and stuff. So I'm not saying to completely stick your head in the sand, but if you let yourself be so spun in a whirlwind of what others are handing you in terms of what the media is telling you, or what is going on out in the world, you're going to actually absolutely be a wreck. So I wouldn't say to just escape in the esoteric, but I say ultimately you will find the real deal things inside, and it won't be coming from the outside, right? And you reference the falsity of something like modern day religions, which are kind of dogmatic at best these days, or fundamentalist at worst. One thing that tells me that a lot of people that are very religious, it's not their own thing, because they all kind of believe the same stuff, right? Like they all believe X and they all believe Y and they all believe Z, and it's kind of like this march of the penguins.
It's Wikipedia.
So it's like, yeah, it's Wikipedia. Or it shows me that when you see a mega church of people, doing things that are, there's this Twitter account where this person, called God, where he says, "I'm profoundly offended by mega churches. Please stop being fake Christians." It's like when there's a room full of a massive amount of people, it's not something that's a mass market, mass audience thing, right? So the psychedelic experience is very much an internal, individual thing, right? It's your own thing. And I'm coming to find that anything that is mass marketed is generally just there for the dollar signs. And anything that is a real transcendental thing, like, again, an old person, a little shamanistic woman that's giving you a sacrament in a hut in the rainforest, there's not a lot of money in that, right? So that type of thing is your own dynamic of your own spiritual journey. But in art form is an extension of that, because a lot of the times when you do an art piece, you're doing a painting and you're doing it by yourself, right? So it is a very much of a mindful thing and a kind of internal conscious thing where you're creating something that may be influenced by something that you've seen or something that you've done, but it's kind of all correlates, right? It's all about like what you create for yourself. Because I think a big part of why we're here is to understand these things and to kind of evolve through what we create. And again, to kind of reference in being service of that kind of great work again.
Right.
Yeah.
But you know what? A conundrum that I have is those mega churches, those, churches that lack spirituality, but they do offer something good. Is they do offer some sort of a guideline for people to behave, people that are not discovering the esoteric self yet, people that are not in touch with, psychedelic drugs or the works of Terence McKenna or Alan Watts. This is what they know, right? They know the Bible, they know Jesus. And sometimes when I look at that, I have two thoughts. One thought is that I feel kind of bad for them because, not that I'm better than them, but, they're worshiping something that has no spirituality. There's no meaning behind the worship. There's no intentions behind it. It's just a very dead and rigid type of worship where before you eat, you gotta pray, and they just kind of do it to get it over with. And it's more of a habit more than anything. But on the other side, it gives them a guideline. It gives them something to abide by, to live by. And sometimes I think about that, and I think that it might be better than nothing. It might be better than not having any type of guideline or any type of ritual or habit. So I don't know, man. I'm really torn between the two, because on one hand, I feel like they're just doing it for the sake of it, and a lot of times they're doing it out of fear. They're doing it because they don't want to go to hell. I was at the hospital a couple weeks ago because one of my family members was in the hospital, so I went to visit him. And I guess there's a guy on the room, next room, that was going to die soon. And there was a pastor, like a father or something, like a Christian or Catholic father that was rushing into the room. And you can see the whole family surrounded the bed, and the pastor's giving some sort of a blessing or something. And I thought that was, no disrespect to the guy that was sick, but I thought the entire thing was really ridiculous, man. It's like, you're about to die. You're about to go into the next incarnation, into the abyss. And there's this guy in an outfit that's supposed to be representing Jesus or God, that's telling you, hey, man, you'll be okay when you die. You'll be fine. You'll go to heaven because I'm here and I'm part of Jesus's gang. And I'm here to give you the okay to go to heaven, even though I don't know what you have done in your life. I don't know you at all. Me and you are not close. We don't have a relationship outside of this one. I'm here to give you the okay to go to heaven because one of your family members paid me to come here. And I thought, man, there's no spirituality in this. Why don't you do an Aldous Huxley, man? Take LSD on your deathbed or something. Or even if you've had any type of psychedelic experience in your life, you would know that this guy is full of shit, man. Like, this Catholic father, he doesn't know Jesus. He doesn't know Jesus more than you know Jesus. He's faking the whole thing. So I just found it to be really ridiculous how, we have these canned religions out nowadays. But then another part of me thinks that maybe it's better than nothing, man. Maybe it is in this lifetime, they're not going to know the Terence McKenna's of the world or the Aldous Huxleys of the world. But in this lifetime, this is where they're at. This is their level, and it's okay because it is still better than nothing. What do you think about that?
I mean, well, it depends on kind of where you are in, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, if you're struggling so much that you're absolutely poor on the street and, you don't even have a roof over your head, or you're slinging, some sort of narcotic on the street corner and are doing, hellish things just to get to the next day, then, if there is a church that is very much an exoteric outer religion church and they've got a soup kitchen, that's great of the church to do that. And if the church is building a community for people in a small town so that they can get together and not just feel lonely and isolated and compartmentalize capitalism, that's great. So, and then, a classic example is if somebody's like, gone through some hellish, awful situation, like they're in some sort of prison camp or, have been incarcerated and they found Jesus, that's great, right? If that's where you're at, if you're that low in the dynamic. But ultimately for mass groups of people, I mean, the con of so much of what modern day religion is, it's not so much in the text, because even the texts themselves have some really beautiful, deeply wise and coded information in them that's been so misinterpreted through the years and watered down and co-opted and rewritten and retranslated that it's such a delusion from what it really once was. And what was the Gnostic scrolls of that were found in the desert that show a different kind of angle on what Christianity really is and the origins of religion, really kind of gives some insight as to, the fact that much of religion, if not all of religion, is based on astrotheology and shamanism. And these things have been essentially, shamanism is as old as the hills, right? It's been around since as long as forever. And these religions, the best way I've heard it described is they're young and new, right? So even Judaism, which is many thousands of years old, it's like a baby, right? So compared to like what the ancient mystery traditions were doing of the mystery schools, which was a study of something called the mysterium, which again was kind of what they very barely tapped at the Eleusinian mysteries. But I'm not a historical scholar on the mysteries, but in terms of mystery schools and shamanism, all of those things were what essentially were co-opted by religion and taken over, because there's a lot of juicy information there. But the dynamic is that they've taken esoteric material, which is about your internal experience, and they've co-opted it into exoteric material, right, which is about the five senses. So it's really easy to mass market to massive groups of people to just believe in some corporeal being that supposedly once lived, when in reality, like Jesus, for example, is not, a man that once lived. Jesus is the SUN of God, like the sun in the sky, that is, dies for 3 days on the celestial cross in the winter equinox and is then reborn. So all these things are corollaries to astrotheology, which is the worship of the sun and the moon and the stars, to show us that we are essentially the divine beings ourselves, right? Not from an egotistical standpoint, but just to know that, as I talk about our real true spiritual growth, is that everything that is the secret sauce can be found within you if you really kind of dive deep to get there. But it's hard work, right? And most people aren't willing to do it. And it takes a lifetime and multiple lifetimes to really do that work, to work on yourself, to be a better person, to be a more stand-up, honorable person. And it's a lot easier to just believe in some random dude that once lived in a mega church full of other people, because that's easy, right? And it's easy to follow things, and it's easy to just believe in things. So it's that kind of dynamic where that's the beauty of shamanism, is it's about your direct internal experience. And that's the beauty of those ancient mystery traditions, is that they forced you to do the work. And then some of those things are very much, able to be done today. I've had some kind of initiatory experiences with some things that stem from kind of ancient mystery traditions, and they've been the most profound things of my life. There's been a few of those that I've been lucky enough to come across. But it's like there's no way that I'd know about any of those things without actually having the development to really do some work on myself. And then I think just because of how this whole learning lab communicates with you, where you're kind of synchronistically led to things, I was very lucky enough to be kind of led to something that then showed me some of that information. So it's like you have to kind of do the work to really get to the next step. It's all like kind of steps along the path. Do you think things happen for a reason? Because I find synchronicities are much more apparent whenever you're meditating more, you're
diving deeper into yourself, your understanding of the universe is better, that's when things are starting to click and things are really synchronistic. And you realize things are happening for a reason. And you've been doing things all this time, even though that thing at the time was kind of meaningless, but then it led you to this point, and it led you to here, and those events gave you the skills, gave you the mind to handle the situation that is today. Do you believe in synchronicities?
Dude, there are no coincidences. I've come to realize there are only levels of Zoom, right? So the more you kind of expand your consciousness, which can be done through an experience or can be done just through your general life practices, and it can be a slow stepping stones along the way. I kind of think back to 2012 as kind of a time when you could argue that we were that's the point when, ancient cultures talked about going from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. 2012 was a real seminal year for me, where just several things in my head clicked. And it was just like, wow, I had to zoom out from stuff, right? Where it's like, I realized that when I see something happening at a structural level or societal level, that it's all illusory in a lot of ways. So you have a series of events along the way where it's not like you just have an immediate introductory blast open. It takes a long time. But if you kind of have that development where you can see that, I think that in what we're in, whatever it is, and I think a lot of it is about us having to figure that out for ourselves. And just like with religion, science is kind of perceives things based on previous assumptions that are assumed to be ironclad true, which isn't necessarily always the case. It shows us that there's a lot more to what we're in than we really think. So I've come to realize that the more that you kind of switch on as a kind of a node in the network that's trying to live a more kind of conscious life, the more to almost kind of, I don't want to speak on behalf of the universe, but the more the kind of universe sees you and kind of knows that you're doing that, and kind of leads you to more kind of synchronicity and magic. And then you have to kind of know and understand how to read those things and how to kind of know that, this feels right to me or this doesn't feel right to me. And for men, dude, it's like for us guys, a lot of guys are very much mind, and women are very much more heart-based. So I think a balance in men is to have a good balance of mind and heart, right? And so my colleague and I talk about this thing called mind, heart, and will, where if you have a good balance of mind and then you have a proper balance of heart, and your heart essentially tells you what to do and how to follow a certain thing that you're reading into, then you use your will to kind of act on that, right? And that's kind of a thing about, and that's a lot about what our astrology shows us, is that, you come in with a kind of certain predestined kit of parts, and then how you engage your will shows you how you're going to lead your life based on this kind of kit of parts that you've been provided this time around.
Wow.
So, that's the dynamic.
That's cool, man.
Yeah, it's cool. And, I've had several heart-based experiences. One stemmed from a job in LA where it was kind of a funny story. I could give you two kind of really interesting heart-based experiences where it's like you learn to follow your heart. And, when I look back on these heart-based experiences where if I had followed it a different way, I'd still be in my old kind of crap situation, and I wouldn't be in such an interesting, better place than I am now. So a lot of guys could learn how to balance out their heart better.
Do you think that you can enhance that with transformative experiences? Because from what I hear, I've never done ayahuasca, but from what I hear in people doing ayahuasca, they always come back to this Western world saying you have to connect more with your heart, because in the West, we use so much of our mind. Everything is mind-based. At work, even in family, with friends, everything is about the mind. And if you follow your heart, it's kind of looked down upon because, what are you, crazy? Like you have to think intuitively, not intuitively, but with a mathematical brain. You have to think logically. Brain. To think intuitively, it's kind of like a caveman thing we do these days. It's really looked down upon, and it's like you have to use logic, you have to use reason, you have to use science. There's so much love towards science today that I think is great, because through science we can find a lot of truths, but then it is not the end all be all, and it can't find a lot of other things that we know esoterically. So I think that using the heart is really underrated in the West.
Yeah, and what the real sciences are, I mean, obviously current day modern science has some great advantages, but there are occult sciences from long ago, that the ancients knew about that have kind of been hidden, that are things like, astrology, for example, that have a lot of validity to them, and they've been much more diluted from what we once knew. But yeah, I mean, these are things that kind of show you on a path of, I think each one of us, I don't want to just say we have kind of a predestined life plan and it's fate, because of course there's some really, larger questions that come into play about like, oh, well, what happens with the entire plane of people that goes down altogether, or like what happens with the baby that dies in a car accident 2 days old? It's like, was that all predestined or pre-planned? Of course, these are answers I don't have, these are things I don't have answers to, but it's like ultimately I think that we kind of follow our heart for what it feels like we want to do in life, right? Because again, it's all about how you live your life. So like you did when you started this podcast, there was something where you probably for a set amount of time, you're like, I feel like I want to start a podcast. And you followed your heart to, do that and think of the rewards that you've gotten out of it, right? And so that's the type of dynamic where you look back at choices that you made because you were heart-based, where it's led you to good places. And I think we all need to do that. And a primal pinnacle one for a lot of people is they don't like their day job. Their day job's crap. They don't like it. They want to be doing something else. And I've had a very nice balance of having some sort of day job that's brought in some revenue, and then had enough of the year to kind of work on these creative projects that are kind of me trying to do more conscious projects like the show. But most people spend their entire lives without following their heart. And I would highly encourage people to kind of do those quests of glory, to kind of get out there and at least take some risks, because there's no rewards without risks.
Yeah, that's a killer, right? The day job, because it really constricts you to that box that you're sitting on, and you can't really do anything else. You can't express yourself honestly. You get drug tested, and you're supposed to wear certain clothes, and it really limits your creativity. And I think that there's a lot of people that don't like it, but they have to do it because they have to make money, and money is the main motivating factor in that. But then if anybody's ever had a psychedelic experience, they would quickly find out that money is just a tool that we use for exchanges. It shouldn't dominate your life. It shouldn't dominate the entirety of your day, and definitely not your mind, because a lot of people, that's all they think about is money. Got money in my mind, and my mind on the money. And
yep.
I think it's a really dangerous way of thinking, because the moment before you die, you're gonna quickly realize that was not important at all. And you can realize that with psychedelics as well. When you take psychedelics, you realize, your ego is fading away, and money really means nothing at that moment. But then, we do live in a marketplace where we use money for exchanges, and it is important for survival. But I think a lot of people should, step out of their comfort zone and take more risks, like you said. Of course, it is really safe and easy to stay with your job, to sell insurance or to sell coffee at Starbucks or whatever. But then what kind of life is that, man? Like, is that a life you want to live? I really don't know.
Yeah.
I can't answer that, because for me, it is not. But the more I think about it, sometimes it is for them, sometimes it is for that person. And, Ram Dass said something really beautiful, that he said, you can be doing any type of job. You don't have to do like a really meaningful job. You could be a lawyer, you could be an accountant, you could be in the police, but then you have to do the job with mindfulness, and you have to have good intentions when you're doing the job. And that's really beautiful, because it's, you could be stuck at a dead-end job. You could be stuck at your desk 9 to 5. But if you switch your way of thinking, if you switch your mindset a little bit, just a few degrees to the left or to the right, it can make a big difference, man. And, I think that's where everything begins. It begins at mindfulness. It begins with shifting the way you think. But that is the ultimate prison we live in these days. We live in a prison of our own minds. And we can't shift our way of thinking. We're so rigid on that, on our way of thinking, on our religion, on our life philosophy, that we're not able to bend when something bad happens. And that's when suffering begins. You know, I've been dealing with this lately. A lot of my friends has been going through like relationship troubles or breakups and divorces and things like that, all within these few weeks. And they have all come to me for whatever reason. Like, I'm not the guy to talk to be honest, you know, when it comes to these things, but they come to me and they ask me questions and advice. And I tell them, man, just shift your way of thinking, man. That's all you gotta do, man. It's the easiest thing to do because you're not really doing anything. Everything is happening within you. But it's also the hardest thing to do, man, because we've been so locked into this mode that to change even a few degrees, it's impossible. But once it happens, man, it's heaven. It's all about how you look at things.
Yeah, it's about shifting your perspective, right? And kind of reinstalling a slightly different operating system. And that's what so many people go from cradle to grave. You know, there was this philosopher named George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff had a great quote that said, "Machines they are born and machines they will die," which means that most people just kind of live in these kind of 9-to-5 work cycle repetitive jobs where they've had the kind of this magic sucked out of their lives to just kind of repeat the same thing all the time until they essentially die, right? And so the most asleep people define themselves kind of by their accomplishments and by their kind of love of material things in terms of money, right? Because money is just a spell. It's just kind of a fabrication. And of course you could go so as far as to, I could, you know, get really conspiratorial about it, where I talk about, you know, where I could say that there's a small amount of like aristocratic families that just, you know, own all the kind of money supply and want you to kind of bow to money because they control the money. And yes, our minds are such powerful things. And of course, we all do have to kind of live in this kind of culture and society today. And money is kind of a representation of our time. So if you can structure your life in ways where you're living much lighter and leaner, you don't have to be such a slave to your, you know, paycheck every day. And of course, everybody's got their own kind of circumstances that they come in with. But it's nice when you have the capability and the flexibility where I think you can balance it, where you have some sort of income stream, and then you also have some time to do that inner work on yourself, or you have time to start a podcast, or you have time to, you know, make your music, or you have time to do those creative things that if you keep at it, and the more that you do them and the more that you kind of do them in service to others and sharing others and helping better others, I think you kind of ultimately will secretly get rewarded. And it's not going to be in terms of like dollar signs, right? It's not going to be like big money. It's going to be in other ways. It's going to be from like the fellowship that you make, or kind of, the community that builds up about it. So that's kind of the thing. And I think so many people kind of just have to get out of their ruts and kind of reinstall that shit.
You know, you were talking about earlier that there are people that are asleep that are doing these robotic actions, and you know, they're the same people that come to me for advice about how to handle certain situations. And I try to tell them my advice. I try to, you know, tell them about my philosophy and the way that I see things and the way that you can also see things. But then nothing really gets through. You know, they just kind of want to hear me talk about it, but they don't really follow my advice.
Yeah,
but the thing
it's hard to do it, isn't it?
the thing is, it's like, I'm really thinking about this a lot lately, is that are there incarnations in this lifetime ready for that transformation, or are there not? If they're not, then anything I tell them is not going to go through because they're not ready for that knowledge. They're not ready for that transformation in this incarnation. Maybe it will take them 5 more incarnations, you know, maybe it will take them 10. And I'm the same thing. I'm not better than them. You know, I have things that I'm stuck on as well. And, you know, am I going to be ready for it during this incarnation? Like, I've been really contemplating that lately, because you try to tell a person that's asleep some really woke advice and it does not get through. It never gets through.
Yeah.
But it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, the information makes sense to them. It makes a lot of sense to them. They're like, they understand logically, they get it, but it doesn't reach their heart. It doesn't pierce their heart at all. So I'm really wondering, like, is this like an incarnation thing? Like, have you not spent enough time in human incarnations to understand this knowledge, or is something else going on? Like, it's really trippy, man.
Yeah, well, the reincarnation thing is something that if you had asked me 3 years ago about reincarnation, I'd be like, no way. But I think through my development, I'm kind of really starting to feel, you can only really speak to what you feel, right? Not through like some sort of blind faith, but because of what kind of resonates with you. And I think that as you get more developed, there is kind of a thing where you read into your subconscious or your dynamic of, and let me give you an example of esoteric versus exoteric. When you put your hands together in a church and pray, that's an exoteric view of something. I'm just praying for something to hope that'll happen. I'm looking to something outside of myself. The esoteric real thing of what that means is that you're merging through your hands the union of your conscious mind and your subconscious mind, right? So your subconscious is kind of the feminine aspect that taps to what you could argue is source, and your conscious mind is kind of your everyday waking state of, oh my God, I got to take the cat out, I got to shop for groceries, I got to get to work, and meditation is all about quieting your conscious mind so that your subconscious mind can come through and give you information. So when you're in that kind of mile a minute, like, doing everything rapid overload, here and there, it's people that are not reading into what is secretly trying to be told to them go through these kind of depression cycles, because depression is a call for course correction, right? So something that you're doing, dude, is you have developed yourself a little bit more than they have, and they're seeing that in you. And so you're resonating that a bit, and they're coming to you for advice, and you're giving some insight. And that's all you can really do. It's not about pushing shit on people or preaching to other people, but it's about putting out good information that resonates with people and that they can either take it or leave it. And I think the best way to look at that is to kind of correlate it with other people's material who are hopefully putting out, non-woo material, really good substantive material of knowledge and wisdom, and kind of cross-correlate with, I like this person's material, I like this person's material. I'm getting correlations as to what they're saying, and I should put those things into actual practice, right? So it's really easy to listen to things, and I think the further along that you go, where you have an understanding or a thing that you're hearing and it's correlating with other things, and it sounds like something that might be worth practicing, like if somebody's like saying, oh, I've taken some flotation tank time and it's been really great for me, and you've heard that for 2 years and you've never acted on it, at some point you probably will then act on it. So it's when you move from just thoughts to actions when then things start to happen. So it's a slow process, right? And you can read old texts and stuff which are in this weird cryptic language called twilight language, where you don't really understand it, and you have to it makes you do the work to get the knowledge out of it, right? To get through the kind of twilight language. So that's all the type of stuff that if people are coming to you for that insight, they're at an early stage. They may be at kind of an early stage in the journey. And certain people that are very good at presenting material appeal to people at an early stage really well. And usually those are people that are much more mass marketed, that have courses or mass appeal or do these huge, have big followings. And typically the people that are really wise wizards are so not really needing to care about any of that, shallow shit anymore. They're not going to be these massive book tour people, or they're not going to be like, oh, I have some massive social networking following. They're going to be much more somebody that you may find synchronistically if you're lucky enough, and it's always a one-on-one thing where knowledge is passed verbally from one person to another. So it's nice that you see some people are coming to you for insight, and whether or not they act on it is up to them. But ultimately, it's only like when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Right.
The way I look at it is that I'm just planting the seed, so that when they are ready to receive that knowledge, it is already within them, and they can just reach upon that knowledge well and use it in their lives. And I think that the way that I look at human beings is like we're like trees. It takes forever for us to grow, to develop into something. But, we should have more patience with each other, because with a tree, you're not going to expect a tree to, grow into a big tree in a week. It takes a lifetime sometimes. And that's the way that I look at it, is that, we have to have more patience with each other. I'm not trying to force anything upon other people whenever they're coming to me for advice. I'm trying to tell them about my experiences or the things that I find really helpful. And if it helps them, that's great. If not, then it will help them in the future, if it's not now, So
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's a great metaphor, dude, of the tree, because you look at like a massive redwood that's 1,000 years old. I mean, to go back to kind of the comments about reincarnation and just feeling that there's some validity in that, and I've kind of come to think that's got logic in it, because a lot of ancient stuff that I looked at all kind of points to reincarnation. Maybe that takes thousands of lifetimes, right? And a lot of Eastern traditions talk about thousands of lifetimes of growth and development before you really get there, where even the most dumbass person that's, sipping on the Slurpee and acting like an idiot and at the NASCAR race or something, that's drinking 6-packs of Bud Light, will eventually become an absolutely astral, multidimensional Buddha badass. That's type, and it may take thousands of years, right? So, and maybe you go through many, many lifetimes before that really does happen. So that's just something that I can't, say yay or nay on, but there's some inner thing to me feels that there's some validity in that.
Yeah.
But it's a long process.
It is a long process. And the way that the Buddhists describe reincarnation is that it takes, if imagine there's a mountain and there's like an eagle carrying a cloth, and the amount of times that cloth hits the mountaintop for it to shave down into the sand is the amount of lifetimes that it's going to take us to become some badass enlightened Buddha. So it's going to take a while.
Totally. And in terms of deep time, man, I think our species is way older than we think. And I think we have very little concept of how long we've been around for. And of course, you can talk about all of our environmental destruction and how much we're fucking up the planet and stuff, but that's a whole nother separate conversation. But at the same time, I think that we don't have any perspective on how long time really is in terms of our higher selves or where we really come from, and how even on a different dimensional space, time doesn't even really exist. So time is a whole nother dynamic where, yes, it's like allegories like that really put things into perspective for how long sometimes things take. Because the way that I've heard it said well is that sometimes, it could be thought that we're here kind of from a larger source, so that then that kind of space out there can come to really know itself, because there's no better kind of learning lab than Earth in this realm, in this kind of difficult material realm that is so polarized. We face so much polarization in our day to day, and that's the struggles of life on, spaceship Earth. It's very difficult and it's very polarized, and everything you see is super polarized, and that's a way to learn and discover things. But to get through that, if every species on the network needs to one day get to being this enlightened state, think of how long that would take. Take a long time, millions of years.
Do you think
billions of years?
Do you think things are so polarized today because of the way that society is constructed? Because if we go back to nature, it's not as polarizing it is in our human society, right?
Well, nature has, natural polarization and everything. Mm-hmm. So let's look at like the sun and the moon example, which are kind of seeming to be in the sky as these kind of perfectly balanced equanimities. So we've got, the moon is the cool, dark thing in the sky, which seems to be the same size in the sky as the sun, which is the warm, bright thing. And one brings us dark and one brings us light. And we've got, that type of dynamic and polarization. And then we've got, you look at our political systems, which are just absolutely a joke. So we've got these highly polarized political dynamics where people are either extremely one way or extremely another way. So polarization is oftentimes used as a tool of control by people that know things to control the masses, right? So when you depolarize from things, it is a really balanced way to gain objectivity and to have a step back from something and to not be so controlled by somebody else and what's being handed to you. Because again, it's all about what you kind of discover, each of us on our own. And of course, it's nice to look to wise elders that can actually teach us real things. But I've honestly come to realize that so much information out there is the absolute opposite of what we originally were thinking it to be, as we grew up or as we had certain revealings or dark unveilings or, kind of saw behind the Wizard of Oz curtain moments, that everything at every level is in a lot of ways backwards. So that's kind of the polarization at play where you can kind of step back and see it.
It's kind of like a mind control employed by the Illuminati to polarize everything, right? Sort of, right? Because and it's also fun to be on a polar end of things, right? It's like, it's fun to take on this side. Like, I am a Democrat, or I'm a Trump supporter, or, I'm a gun supporter, or whatever. It's fun because you're on a team, and we don't fight wars these days, not as a tribal society. So it's fun to kind of replicate that back into our lives, into our caveman instincts, to represent a cause. Even hippies, man. Like, I posted something on my Instagram today, and basically it's from Ram Dass Here Now, the book, and it talks about you're basically a person and you throw on these outfits, like you throw on a police outfit, you throw on a hippie outfit. But it's these polarizations that give birth to the other thing. Hippies give birth to the police give birth to the hippies, but we're all one, man. If we strip down all our clothes, we're just human beings. We're not these, polarized opposites that we think we are. But it's fun to be part of that role. It's fun to act in that way, where we can be passionate about a cause. We can be up in arms about something or angry. And I think it's sort of like a form of mind control, where they want you to be at war with each other. They want you to have unrest, so they can do things secretly without you knowing, while you focus on things that don't really matter at all.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the Illuminati is a little bit kind of like the Dan Brown, novelist version of a control system. But I think in, the society and structures that we've made today, which are very much of empire, of the kind of co-opting and controlling of things, it is very true that a very small percentage of people run shit. And I think you could very much argue, like the reference that I gave, that it's a very small amount of kind of aristocratic families that control the banks or control the media or control, much of Hollywood or control, the money system. And so the whole name of the game is to kind of get beings that are very powerful and much more multidimensional and Jedi-like than they think to act like muggles, right? To act like the people from Harry Potter that didn't have access to the magic. Right. So the name of the game in our kind of structured society that we've made today, which has basically been through thousands of years of kind of co-opting beautiful things that were esoteric practices, to turn them into things that are exoteric, that are all about looking outside of yourself because the real keys lie within you, and to delay your true spiritual growth. That's kind of the name of the real game. And these are things that very much it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. So that's kind of the thing I've very much learned. And again, that could go down a whole entire conspiracy rabbit hole. But the rabbit holes are good because when you discover something that's kind of a dark revealing, like let's say I just had a recent conversation with two friends about 9/11, and that, there's 3 layers of ridiculousness with 9/11 that shows you that there's more going on there than you thought it to be, for example. When you have some sort of realization, it's like, oh, the official story is not at all what I thought it to be. It allows you to be like, well, what about these other stories that I was officially being told? And then that kind of unravels the conspiracy rabbit hole. But conspiracy is just kind of a step along the path, right? It's like you learn a lot more by looking at the dark, negative sides of things than you do from the light. But at the same time, that's why all of my psychedelic experiences have been beautiful, little heart-based, opening, just amazingly wonderful experiences. I've never had, quote unquote, a bad trip, you could say. And I think I credit that towards always being hugely respectful of the sacrament and never just kind of doing it willy-nilly or like recreationally. I'd never take anything at like a club or at like, a rave or something. I never really did that when I was growing up. So that type of dynamic is just definitely an interesting one, where the polarity is there to show you the difference between things. But and all of this, again, to talk about how we originally started this conversation, all of this is stuff that, the ancients knew. You can go read old texts by, philosophers that knew a thing or two, and they're talking about all this shit years ago. So the kind of an old axiom is take something old and make it new, right? Kind of put a new wrapper around it. And that's kind of what I'm always trying to share with things that I've learned, where it's like the delivery of the material from 1,000 years ago was horribly vapid and bland and boring. So how do you kind of like put it into new language, to go back to our previous comments about language and sharing the information?
So to wrap things up, before in ancient times, spirituality was thriving. We're at the golden age. back in the Egyptian days, and I heard there's people that it's really easy for people to be enlightened. We are in the dark age now. We are in the Kali Yuga, I think we are. And it is really hard. Everything is against us. We're basically salmon swimming against the current. And, as you know, things go in cycle. Everything goes in cycle. The world is cyclical. Do you think that we are going to go back into the world where, spirituality will be great again? Like, make spirituality great again,
Well, it's a great question you talk about. It's a great question to ask kind of as a wrap up, dude, because I've talked about this in this essay I did where I was talking about cycles of time, which lends very heavily into something called the precession of the equinoxes, which is basically a 25,000 some year cycle of time where the Earth essentially has gone through 6 great extinctions where things have been completely rebooted on the planet through some sort of disaster. But between the millions of years of those extinctions, we've had these kind of ways where you can think of time not as being linear, but as being cyclical. And I don't think of it as basically just a complete circle. I think of it as almost like a spiral where we kind of remember and we forget. And we kind of have to know thyself and, remember who we are and what we once were. So if reincarnation is valid and we've been here thousands of times, you in past lives have been some Genghis Khan character, and you've also been some incredibly enlightened deity character. Not to say that any, real ascended master is, here on Earth today, or like that's even a real thing. Who knows? Maybe it is. But if time is not, matriarchal, it's patriarchal. If we're on kind of like these cycles of time, that really reads into me as to like how you can look at ancient sites and ancient monuments, like, the pyramids, for example, where they knew how to build something that we could not replicate now. So that type of dynamic where time is very cyclical because of like the precessional cycles where we have essentially a 25,000 some year cycle where for half that time the species as a whole goes down in consciousness and then raises up in consciousness. That to me really resonates, right? So, and you can look at some of the Egyptologists that have talked about, water erosion on the Sphinx and stuff like that. I don't know if you've heard about any of that material. Where it's
Graham Hancock type stuff.
And like all the magical Egypt guys, which are doing great work because they're looking at Egypt from a very much a third eye perspective. And until you look at Egypt from a third eye perspective, you're not even out of the sandbox yet. You're still you're barely even getting into kindergarten. But there's evidence to show that the Sphinx is significantly older than we think. And so there's thoughts of the Sphinx being multiple precessional cycles old, which leads us to believe that Egypt is old as fuck, right? So, and then there's architecture and geometry and building and engineering and those things that we could not recreate today. So I think that all of this kind of mindset where we look at ancient things and ancient sites and ancient monuments where we think that like, it was aliens that built it. We're so disconnected from what we once were, where, we're in this kind of like dumbass, NASCAR, Slurpee, Bud Light, Donald Trump, Pizza Hut, McDonald's level consciousness. And as the precessional cycle goes back up, which we're actually coming out of the Kali Yuga stage now, which is what 2012 was all about, we're kind of coming back up into consciousness. So the species over maybe the next 14,000 years, if we don't kill ourselves off, is coming back into what my colleague Rack calls like 5-bar galactic Godhead consciousness, right? Where it's like the cell phone signal has been degraded to like 1 bar. And, we went through the dark ages where it was completely awful and hierarchical and the church ruled and they'd, you said the wrong thing and they just kill you in 2 milliseconds. That was kind of maybe the low part of the sine wave. So you look at time as like a sine wave, right? And then as we come up out of this crest and trough, so we're coming out of a trough of the sine wave of time, we're going back up into this like higher consciousness state. And I think as we do that, to talk about the resurgence of shamanistic practices, people remember that they have these kind of abilities to be medicine people, to have a larger connection to the greater ecology and so we essentially move into this kind of multidimensional badass state of eventually becoming, this gets really esoteric, but going back to the light, right? Becoming beings of light, of higher, dimensions and things like that. So that's kind of my ultimate takeaway from knowledge through time. And mystery traditions are very likely what I've kind of realized is a preserving of the knowledge from the previous precessional cycles of time.
Man, that was amazing, man. I think we could talk for hours. And Man, you're an amazing guest, man. I gotta have you back on the show this year, man. It's just, I think me and you, we can talk for many hours about esoteric stuff and conspiracy theories and and things like that. It's amazing, man. So where can people find you, and how can people watch the documentary and help make it better and fund it and things like that?
Yeah, well, the show can be found at shamansoftheglobalvillage.com. And, just the pilot episode exists right now. We're hoping to maybe get to the second episode in 2017. So hopefully shoot it. We're figuring out who it's going to be with and what sacrament it will be. But, you can find the show there. It'll always be there. And then, me personally as the kind of director of the show, Rack is the host of the show, and Rack's website is rackrazan.com. And me as the director of the show, Niles Heckman, I can be found at nilesheckman.com. So you can kind of find my, various things that I'm all about there. Always trying to embed wisdom into things. But yeah, thanks, Ed. It's fun chatting, man. And I appreciate, you kind of having me on here. It's been nice talking, and it's just always nice to kind of reach out and find other people. And I agree, dude. It's been a fun chat. We should definitely do it again in the near future.
Yeah, man. And we got to have Rack on too, man. He sounds like a real poet and cool figure. And I really want to talk to him and see what he's about. And it's amazing, man. I never expected this, to be honest, because you never know who's going to come on the show and if they're going to be interesting or they're going to be boring. Because, to be honest, to be totally honest, I've had a few guests that, that I was zoning out, like struggling. I'm trying to keep the ship, floating, but the ship was sinking and there's no way I can rescue it. But today, man, it was amazing because you can just talk hours on end about esoteric stuff, and it really shows your passion and knowledge into these things. And I really love people like that, man, because I'm also a person like that. And, if it's not the podcast, I usually, me and my friend will have these conversations just over a beer or maybe at a bar or something. And they're really one of the most fascinating conversations because you can know so much about a person when you talk about these subjects. And these subjects are so interesting, and I think our audience, they also really dig this type of stuff. And we talk about psychedelics a lot on the show, but a lot of psychedelic knowledge links to esoteric stuff, links to Eastern philosophies and mysticism and religions and conspiracies and things like that. So I really love it when the show covers the entire spectrum of things in psychedelic world, not just, how was your trip in Peru with ayahuasca, that's cool and all. But man, once in a while, I love a show where we cover the whole spectrum. And I think we did that today. Not the whole spectrum, but at least a good 80% of it. And, you guys live very interesting lives, and you guys have many stories to tell. You guys meet so much people during your work, filming a show. And, not everybody can say that they have a toad experience, and meeting God when you smoke a toad boil, you know what I mean? So it's
totally. Yeah, it's a very special thing to even have the honor to be presented with, and so I don't discount that. And that's something that the show has been a reward for me. It's like you have a reward from this podcast by meeting cool people. And like I got rewards out of, I have this show that we're doing, and then I have an upcoming documentary that we're going to put out now that it's 2017. And both of these projects have been like huge rewards because of just the interesting people I've been around and just the amazing things that have come out of them. So I totally agree, man. And it's been, I know what you mean. It's awesome having enriching and fulfilling deeper conversations, which like so many people that are listening to this, we all suffer from having a lack of in our direct lives. So that's why people find the community and listen to these things. And anybody out there that might be interested in talking to me, I'd love to hear from you. I'd be delighted to kind of chat to you. I'm kind of getting more and more into kind of helping consult people as well on kind of their development and stuff. So just like you were talking about people coming to you for insight and wisdom, that's That's awesome. And it's not about being some bullshit guru or something. It's just about saying like, hey, this works for me. It might work for you.
Yeah.
And look, I'm putting it into practice.
Right. Yeah, it's not a egotistical thing at all, I think. It's more of a, this worked for me. Why don't you try it? If not, that's fine, And if it works, then we could be friends, Even if it doesn't work, we can still be friends, It's just about connecting with other like-minded folks or not like-minded folks. And we can, create some kind of community or like satsang, as the Hindus call it, and it's great, man. So thanks again for coming on the show, and yeah, let's have you back on again soon, man. It's a real treat to have you on.
Yeah, anytime, bud. Hugs to all.
And that was Niles Heckman. Hope you guys enjoyed the podcast as much as I had fun talking to him. And I think this episode was a really good one because of the subjects that we covered. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. If you guys do, please go on iTunes and leave us a good review there. It will help out this podcast a lot. It will bump us up in the iTunes rankings, and more new listeners will be able to discover our show. And the more plays and downloads that we get, the bigger and better guests we'll be able to book for our show. So go on iTunes right now, search for Psychedelic Milk, press 5 stars, and that's all you gotta do. You don't actually have to type in a review. All you have to do is press 5 stars under ratings and reviews for our podcast. So thank you guys so much for doing that. I love you guys. Until next time, bye bye.